So I want to welcome you to this session of Watching Paint Dry. I'm Kim Santini, and I have these sort of events as a way to invite you into my studio, ask questions about my work or my process, other things about perhaps my background, and also give you some insight into how I work and some of the problems that I solve as a working artist. So I'm really happy that you're here with me. Today, I want to walk you through a slideshow of the creation of the painting that is here behind me on the easel. And her working title right now is Sediment. And I chose that word. I am a huge fan of geology and rocks and minerals, and I'm in the process of learning a lot more than I currently know about them. It's a fascinating field to me. But I love the idea of a sedimentary rock and how sediment forms or creates. It's particles that settle in layers, and the particles are made up of previously living matter. And when I think about my artistic path and the things that I've learned as an artist and how each painting sort of accumulates knowledge in my experience banks and my toolkit, every painting builds on the one that's previous to it. And this particular painting really felt like she pulled in a lot of the elements and things that I appreciate doing the most from the last year or so of work. So the title seemed really fitting to her. We'll see if it sticks until she's finished. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll walk through this painting. Can you see this okay? If you can, give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, thumbs up, wherever that is.
Perfect. Okay. Sounds good. So this is not this painting in her current state, but this is how sediment started. I often work over top of previous paintings. And what also happens is when I get an idea, and I call my idea what ifs. So when a what if hits me, some of them need to be approached from multiple angles. And this piece was part of a what if my spirit animal entered from more than one plane of the painting. And I did a number of pieces simultaneously, sort of exploring this idea. Two of them I finished and resolved. This third one, and each of those paintings was a little different in its approach. And this one, with the rabbits facing away from each other and a physical overlap to their body, it wasn't doing it for me. And it wasn't for lack of effort. It was just that I found that there were a lot of design problems and things that shifted when the rabbits' bodies touched versus when they were separate. And I wasn't going to be able to resolve this without doing a complete rework and repositioning them with more space between their bodies, which meant I needed a different shaped panel. So this particular painting went in my paint over pile, and it was a candidate for who knew what. But one day I decided I had been dreaming a lot about horses, and my dreams and real life experiences are what I pull or channel my subject matter from. So one day I came into the studio and I really wanted to paint a horse, and I had an idea of a horse looking at me with her neck space sort of dissolving off into sky. So I wanted the horse to not be completely solid, but I also wanted her to have different elements of a landscape and to possess a sort of vastness in her, since that was how she appeared to me in my dream. So I grabbed this rabbit panel and I drew the horse in over top of them. Now you can still see that there are multiple places. There's actually a couple of eyes that are still visible. The ears are still visible. The dark shadow in the upper right corner is part of that original painting, as is the sweep of blue, or more of a warmer blue that comes off of her neck or withers there on the left. So one of the things that I particularly appreciate about working over top of a previous painting is that this conversation starts to happen between these two works that previously were completely separate from each other. And I call this process a controlled collision. It's sort of like collage, except that with collage, you select and you place pieces together with intention. This isn't really this isn't as intentional or as controlled as a collage might be. But what I'm able to do is pick and choose the pieces that I want to save from the previous painting and incorporate them into the new piece as she's evolving. And what it also does is it gets me thinking about shapes in a different way. For instance, this ear shape here that stretches from her cheek across her neck, this shape, which was an ear in the previous painting of the rabbit, actually becomes part of the landscape in the final painting. It becomes a horizon line. I really loved the way that shape sort of butted up at a 90-degree angle to the plane of her cheek. And I appreciated that so much that I kept it. So when I first block in, that's what I call this stage. When I first block in a painting, I draw it in with charcoal and I use glazes or transparent paints as I begin to manipulate and play with the planes of the form. So I'm thinking about dimensionality of form, but I'm also thinking about the space, meaning the physicality of the depth of the air in the painting itself. Lately, I've been really interested in skies and clouds and the concept of how air moves around us. We don't see it. There are times when we can feel it moving around us, but we don't necessarily see it. But I want it to feel very present in my paintings. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in this early stage. And I'm also playing with the push and pull between the previous painting and the concept that is beginning to show up. I also really don't have an idea as to what the end painting is going to be like. I had that vague concept or image of how the horse appeared in my dream. But I'm not going to stay married to that. That is my starting point. And I'm just going to I'm going to set that down in paint in the first couple of passes. And then what happens is I begin to have a conversation with the painting. And I sort of let that idea go. I don't want to try to force it on to what is showing up here in front of me. It's more of a seed, and I'm just going to let the process itself and different sorts of connections that happen between seeing shapes or putting different marks down over top of the piece. So you'll see here that ear shape has definitely become some sort of cliff or hillside. And I've taken that blue space, I've created a sense of sky here to the left of her eye. And I'm beginning to fill her head with green. I really love using arbitrary color. It's just something that I really enjoy. I love surprises in artwork. And to me, arbitrary color is a really wonderful way to surprise the viewer and get them to think about a shape or a mark in a different way than they might otherwise. And I'm also sort of thinking compositionally about my values and the balance of the piece. So I have a dark column in the, not totally in the middle, a little offset. And that dark column bleeds off to the right. And then I have another dark column that starts from the lower left and sort of leads the viewer's eye towards the center of the painting. So thinking about the design of the piece as well as playing with the color elements. And the white lines that you see are actually just sidewalk chalk. I have boxes of sidewalk chalk and I use those to redraw or play with ideas. When the painting's dry, I can draw right on it with the chalk, and then I can wipe it off without impacting the surface in any way. It's a great way for me to audition things before I commit to them and paint. So some of the things that I really like at this point, I absolutely love that upper left corner. And that's mostly residual from the first painting that I painted over top of. You may recall that warmer blue that I mentioned when we were looking at one of the very first slides. And right now I'm thinking about the importance of her gaze. It's sort of characteristic of my work that the spirit animal sees or acknowledges the viewer in some capacity. And with this painting, I was curious from the onset about how far I could push those eyes into just being flat shapes or shadows instead of having them come to life. I really wanted them to be simple, and I wanted to explore the idea of pushing that head back into a place of less importance. Because what happens with our brains when we see a face, even if it's an animal face and not a human one, we hone in and we lock in on that, and that becomes our focal point. And I was curious what would happen to the concept of the face if those eyes were not clearly defined, and if that nose felt a little bit jittery, or the muzzle. I've drawn a couple different horse heads over top of this particular shape at this point. So the nostrils aren't totally lined up. My eyes aren't, one eye is from a different orientation of a head, another eye is more closely aligned with how it's drawn, how the rest of the head shape is drawn. So I'm playing with this idea of jitteriness too, like sort of in the cubistic sense, how the cubist would try and draw a form from multiple angles at the same time. I'm thinking like, can I really abstract that cheekbone that's adjacent to that pink hillside and have it feel like the hillside is actually growing out of that cheekbone? And how much can I blur the definition of landscape butting up against a horse cheek? You know, how much can I blur that, and extending that then into the concept of the eye? And here I am. The previous version, I wanted to add some more interest to the negative space around the head. So I felt like in the previous version, all of my hard edges were in the head itself or in that cliff side. And I really needed to add some more line work or edges to the piece in order to create interest around the whole surface. So one of the things that I like to try and do is give each part of the painting equal attention or equal opportunity to impact the end result. So in simplistic terms, what that means is I'm not going to paint a horse and then choose a background color and rub that in around her. I really want the whole surface to be integrated, and I want every mark, whether it's residual from the first painting, you know, the painting that I started with that I painted over top of, I want every mark to serve a purpose and speak to the whole of the piece. So that is what I'm doing here with the chalk marks or the chalk lines. I am assessing all of the different shapes that I see in the painting, figuring out how I want to move them or manipulate them to better tell the story. And then once those chalk lines are in place, I grab my brush and I start to work. So you'll see here that I've really pulled some darker shadows into the horse's head. I've softened a lot of those edges, and I've begun to blend my marks out or create secondary shapes in addition to the head. So it's not just this, excuse me, it's not just the horse head with all this amorphic air around it. There are other things that are happening. And I really fell in love with this cross section here of her neck and shoulders. It feels, I intentionally drew in flower petal patterns and shapes because I saw some of them over here in this negative space. And I really like the idea of bracketing things. But I love this colorway here that's happening in all these neutrals. I just think they are so exciting for me to look at. And I love this corner because I felt like I appreciated this dark shape, and I really love this peak of pink sun coming through, but it needed something else. It needed a counterpoint to it. I like to include threes or an odd number of things in my painting. And this pink light along with this yellow light here, I needed a third lighter component. And so I popped that up there. And right now I'm realizing that it's too strong, number one, but it, from a design standpoint, it does exactly what I needed it to do, because this dark shadow mark was almost sliding the viewer's eye up and off over the top of the canvas. And this sort of redirected it straight over to the horse's head. So there is a method to my madness in a lot of ways. I call my painting process intuitive because I don't really know where I'm going to end up. And I spend a lot of time just following my gut and saying, oh, I wonder what would happen if I tried this. And so I try that. And here you see that I've really darkened the horse's face quite a bit. And I'm playing with the idea of a warm to a cool transition in those shadows. So in the left-hand side of her face, it's very warm. It comes forward. It approaches the viewer. It feels like it's closer to the picture plane surface because of that warmth to the browns and the dark shadows there, which are also echoed, by the way, over here in this mark here on the far edge. And this mark had to happen because it was also a way of interrupting the sweep that sort of seemed to be swallowing up the painting. I really wanted to try and preserve some of this, but it needed to change in order to serve the whole painting. Going back to that idea I mentioned earlier about every mark having a purpose and focused on an end goal. And so we went from warm here on the left-hand side to a cooler shadow over here. And this area is really deep, deep green. And you maybe can't see it very clearly on your computer, but in person, the painting really shifted powerfully. And as a result, what that did is it pulled this side of the face forward. It made this side of the head feel like it was closer to the viewer than this side of the head. And that created a really interesting torque or tension around the form as it modeled. I really liked that a lot. And so the painting sat at this stage for a bit, and I thought she was done. But I realized that, you know, she was interesting, but she wasn't fully cohesive. This shape here felt really awkward and super dark, and this felt equally dark, and the ears, there was just some sort of level of dissatisfaction. But I needed to look at her for a week or so before I was able to see that, because I don't know if you're like me, but when I create something and I fall in love with the idea of it, or maybe, you know, a section of it, then I only see that idea or that section, and I'm not able to really look at the execution of the entire piece, or the distillation of that idea into a clear message that others can see. So sometimes I need time in order to process that. And that's what I gave myself with this piece. And I began to, or I thought my first solution was to eliminate a lot of the hard edges inside the head again. So I went back into her head and I did a lot of glazing. You'll notice that I softened up or broke into that really large dark shadow shape on both sides of the head. And I changed the line on the right-hand side and eliminated the profile of that eye altogether, and sort of allowed the top of her head to dissolve into that shadow, sort of smoky arm that was reaching off the side of the canvas. And I felt like this was a step in the right direction, but it really wasn't quite enough. So I continued to work on her. And this is where she is. And now, you'll notice I brought a good amount of definition into those ears. I felt like I was non-committal in the ear shapes in previous incarnations of this painting. And that allowed the top of the painting to feel wishy-washy. And I didn't want that. I extended the blue-gray from her top line behind the ears and allowed it to drip down into her forelock, and also sort of have it dissolve into that smoky space in the upper right. And I feel like that was a much more successful way to handle that aspect of the painting. You'll notice that the right side of her face is a value step lighter than the left side of her face. And I might take it lighter even still. I'm not really sure. When I squint down at her, it still feels equally as dark as the left. And I'm thinking that I want to have a little bit more of a dissonance between the two edges of her face, or the way her face is framed. So I may take this into Procreate, which is an app I use on my tablet or iPad, and I can digitally manipulate this painting in Procreate and see if what happens when I lighten that edge on the right-hand side. How does that shift things up a bit? And I also did some glazing and rearranged my color temperatures in the negative space around the horse, so that what used to be that pink, that cooler pink light over on the left is now a warm yellow. And that warm yellow is reflected off of the inner cheeks or the inside of her face, where it butts up against that landscape. And then there's a cooler light that is behind her, meaning underneath or behind her nose, her muzzle. And that cooler light sort of sweeps up behind her, wraps behind her, and we get a peek of it up behind her right ear. And that sweep of light reaching behind her head and neck also allows that darker shape that goes off to the right of the painting to have a bit more substance and solidity. And I appreciate that more. So there's a really fascinating sort of push and pull that's happening in this piece that is unexpected, related to how we would normally perceive an object in space. Typically, a painting presents us with a subject matter, being, in this case, the horse, where the horse would be the closest to the picture plane and the objects behind her would be further away. But in this case, I have carved out sort of a vessel-like shape inside the horse's neck and brought a landscape that feels like it's closer to the viewer, or as close to the viewer as elements of the horse's face. But then there's little pockets of the horse herself that feel like they might be portals, they might be receding in space. And yet then there's this other sort of vastness or airiness, expanse, that it sits behind her. So I really love putting together veils that play with the viewer's perception of space in a canvas or in a painting. And I keep saying canvas, but actually this is a hard panel. It's completely flat. It is not a stretched canvas at all. So there you have it, a little quick walk through the process of this painting. And I want to throw the floor open now to some Q&A. Feel free to unmute yourselves and let me know what questions you might have.
Thanks, Kim. It took me like 15 minutes to finally get in today. I don't know.
No.
Yeah, I couldn't find the link. Actually, I don't even know where I ended up getting in at the last minute there.
I'm sorry to hear that, Wendy. I'll look into that and see what's going on.
It wasn't anywhere under the watching paint dry. I was clicking on everything trying to find it.
The join button never showed up?
No.
Okay, so that's a Facebook error. Well, shoot.
Like it went light and I couldn't click on it. So anyways, okay. I'm glad I got in.
I am too, and I'm sorry for the frustration.
That's okay.
I did record this, so you'll get the whole
get
the whole recording if you I don't recall exactly when you stepped in, Wendy, but
I think it was about, I don't know, 5 or 8 minutes after.
Okay.
So I love how you've changed, like how you make the changes or think about the changes. And then the landscape beside the horse's head is very cool. And underneath it, upside down, you have 3 bunnies.
oh my gosh, I did not even see that. You're right.
Yes,
So the rabbits stuck around.
yes.
I find it really interesting how different the piece looks here
Mhm.
on my monitor than it did in the photos from the slideshow too. It's interesting when I think it's spatial perception. There's a lot of lightness around it right now, so it sort of tends to become a little bit more contrasty, and you don't see the nuance that is really visible when it's cropped in. And there is quite a bit more color to it than how it's showing here as well.
When you think about changing a value, what do you add to the color to change that value?
That's a really good question. So it depends on how I'm shifting my value. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you could go about it, but for me, my biggest question when I'm shifting my value is, am I shifting it chromatically or am I just shifting it tonally? So if I'm going to shift it tonally, then I'm going to probably reach for a glaze of a neutral gray or a Payne's gray because they don't have a whole lot of color to them. Neutral gray has 0. I mean, well, it doesn't have a whole lot of saturation or hue. And Payne's gray has a little bit of blue to it, but it's inherently transparent. So I can stroke it over top of what's there and know that my underlying marks will still be visible. It'll just
So is
darker.
that a neutral gray in golden?
Payne's gray is not a neutral gray. Payne's gray is a gray leaning towards blue.
Yeah, no, I have it, but
Yeah.
what about that neutral gray? Is it a
Neutral
golden?
gray, yes. So I'm glad you asked so I can clarify. Golden has a series of neutral grays, and I think they run from a 2 to an 8 or a 9. So they have no chroma to them whatsoever, and they are stepped to match a 10-step value scale.
Okay.
And so I use, now I'm gonna have to remember, I use 3, 5, and 8, and I lay them out on my palette. And I originally I started laying them out on my palette off to the side as a way for me to gauge when I was mixing chromatically what my value was, because I see color before I see value, and I was struggling with having the right values in my work. So a way I thought I could fix that would be to add those neutral grays to my palette, and then as I'm mixing, I can put it on my brush and I can hold it up to, you know, my light gray, my middle gray, my dark gray, and that would help me gauge where the value was of my mixture before I put it on my painting. And then I started using the grays to mix with and began to see, and that was about the same time that I added the neutral or the earth colors into my palette. And it taught me how to tonally shift value versus chromatically shift value. And I've always shifted value chromatically in the past, meaning if I wanted to go darker, I'm going to reach for a darker color because I don't use black on my palette. I'm going to, you reach for a darker color to push this mixture darker. So let's say I have an orange and I need that orange to be a step darker. I might go for alizarin crimson, or I might go for a cobalt green to push that orange darker. And by adding a color to a color mixture, you're changing it chromatically. If I were to take that same orange and add like a neutral green 8 to it, which is a pretty dark, or neutral gray 8 to it, it's a pretty dark gray. It's not going to shift or move that orange much. It's just going to dull it down and make it darker. So the long answer to your question, or the short answer to your question is, if I want to go darker in value, the first thing I have to determine is, am I going darker chromatically? Am I going darker tonally? because we know chroma demands attention, whereas a tone does not. It simply helps to define the form. So I have to decide that, and then I choose an approach based on whether I want to glaze it and retain the brush marks that are underneath, or do I want to put an opaque mark right over top of it and just shift the value completely. And then I would mix my paints accordingly, whether I'm going with the glaze or opacity in chroma or tonality.
It's a lot to think about.
It is a lot to think about. And my advice for you would be just go with the path that feels easiest at this point, but know that you have another alternative if you're frustrated and you don't get the results you want.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. That was a great series of questions. Arlene, did you have anything you wanted to ask?
No, I don't think so. I'm just truly amazed by the whole thing, the dreamlike quality. And then you mentioned cubist, and gosh, way in the beginning when you were first forming it, that's the first thing that popped into my mind was that cubist form you had there. And I'm mostly here for inspiration to get started again. So
Well,
I
that's
just really,
fantastic. I'm glad that you saw the cubistic beginning. I recently took a workshop, and one of the where I studied I studied art movements from ancient Greek to contemporary, and one of the assignments was to create a cubistic painting. And in my head, I always thought cubism was easy. And conceptually, you draw a piece of an object, and then you shift your perspective and you draw it again, right? And you shift it and you draw it again. So conceptually, it should be really easy to do, but in practice, it's freaking hard. It was really, really, really hard. And I was really mesmerized by the process and intrigued, and I would like to do more of it. But I feel like these sorts of things right now are bigger what ifs and more fascinating what ifs to me at the moment than that. But I do see some discordance or dissonance or jitteriness more of that coming into my subject matter in the future. Once I feel like I've resolved the spatial concepts that I'm trying to embrace, and that would be the next what if that I would choose to move into.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I'm really grateful. Betsy, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question. I'm really grateful that you ladies persevered and you got in here, and I'm sorry if there was any frustration. And now I'm extra glad that I recorded this, because that'll give me an opportunity to share it for anybody else who maybe couldn't get in also. But I really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming into the studio and hanging with me for a little today.